Welcome, everybody. I'd just like to start this particular meeting with doing our land acknowledgement that we have worked on fastidiously with the Tomva community over a long process in which we talked about the name Tomva, what it meant, and how they wanted to be acknowledged in this process. We worked with cultural leaders, we've worked with practitioners, and we've worked with the actual archaeological history and such. Now, as most of you know, UCLA sits on Tomva land. Now, we're using Tomva particularly because actually UCLA, there was no village site at UCLA. The closest village site is Caravagna Springs, which I highly suggest you all go visit if you get to LA. I know some of you are on the East Coast right now, but if you come to LA, it's truly one of the most beautiful spots. And that's a very close site at Uni High that's close to UCLA. That's the closest village that we have. Now, the lineal descent from that village is those people prefer to call themselves the Gabrielino Tomva. And that's why at UCLA, we recognize the Tomva people as the traditional land caretakers of Tavanga, Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraktum, the indigenous peoples in this place. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hodnikvatam, the ancestors, the Ahiram, the elders, and the Yohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. So I wanted to explain that particular, how come we recognize the Tomva here, because there seems to be some discussion that just arose that we'll get to today, and I'll leave that in the hands of our guest star, Desiree Martinez, who will be joining us today. I'm going to do these introductions in just a second here. But before we begin, I also wanted to talk a little bit about why we came here. First, I'll introduce myself. Skanuna. My name is Mashana Goman. I'm Tonawanda Band of Seneca. I am currently the special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous Affairs. And this event is being co-sponsored by the Bruin and also by the American Indian Studies Center. Now, the American Indian Studies Center has excellent events planned throughout this month of November, and I highly suggest you go to the website. Maybe, Sedona, could you please type out the center's home address for that site? Thank you. We'll put that in the chat there so you can have a direct link to all the events that are occurring virtually throughout the month. So we really appreciate you all coming today and spending some time with us. I know a 2-hour Zoom call is a lot, considering many of you have probably been in classes or teaching or doing whatever on Zoom. I've been on Zoom all day myself. So with that, I really just wanted to take a moment to reflect and think about what this is meant to do, which is a workshop, and think about how we should all come together today with a good mind. This is a Haudenosaunee philosophy. This good mind, and the concept of the good mind teaches us to be aware of our thoughts, and most importantly, aware of our intentions. What intentions do we set for this meeting? It opens us up towards peace and balance, and that in essence opens us up to a better learning process and a better learning practice. We can learn when we come together with a good mind and with that intent to be open and to better ourselves. And to better us means also with a good mind is that we will be able to use those gifts we all possess better. So it is my hope here today as well to think about the word maha, which in Tomva, and this is a word I learned from the amazing cultural leader Craig Torres, who taught me what the word maha meant in Tomva, which is that is the swapping, gifting, and sharing exchange, particularly of knowledge that can come through, especially with the intention and paying attention to your surroundings. So I hope these two important concepts of a good mind that we come together with today and maha can be used to lead our discussion today, can be used to create that environment for our discussion today. And I hope that in this discussion, we can bravely enter into this conversation to move toward better passive engagement, particularly as they're reported in the media. And I say this because many of us here are those something else's that was reported by CNN. And if those journalists in the rooms don't understand what something else is, I highly suggest you go on Native Twitter and check it out, because it will be a really fun learning practice for you. So I come here from the land of the Tamva, Tavangnar, and I hope we all engage with a good mind. And it is my pleasure in that sense to welcome Dina with us today. She is from the Colville Confederated Tribes, and she's a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos. Now, CSUM, they do great work. I highly suggest you check out their Native Nations building there, and they have some great reports on California Indian education. She is also an independent consultant and educator in environmental justice policy. So Dina is special. She's wonderful. She works within the field of critical sports studies. I highly suggest reading her work on surfing, because it's educational and really important. She brings her scholarship into focus as an award-winning journalist, which is why we are having her here today as well. She contributes to numerous online outlets, including Indian Country Today, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, and many more. She is the author of 2 books, the most recent one, As Long as the Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock, and is currently under contract with Beacon Press for a new book, which we're excited about, Illegitimate Nation, Confronting Settler Privilege and Moving Toward Transformational Land Ethics. So I would thank you, Dina, for joining us. Now, as a special guest, we have Desiree Martinez, who herself is Tamva. She's a registered professional archaeologist with 22 years of experience in the archaeological fieldwork, research, and curation. She has expertise in planning, implementation, and completion of all phases of archaeological work, and has participated in the archaeological investigations as principal investigator, crew member, tribal monitor, and educator. I'm adding that to her bio because she runs the PIMU Catalina Indigenous Archaeological Field School as well. She meets national standards in archaeology set by the Secretary of Interior standards, but she goes well beyond that and making and creating really important standards of archaeologically, particularly in Southern California. And she works also on sites of historic preservation. Her experience includes compliance with CEQA, NEPA, NAGPRA, SB 18, AB 52, and I will be excited to see what she's doing with the new laws that have just occurred or will be doing, and other cultural resource laws. Currently, she is the president of Cogstone Archaeological Field Site, and she'll be our cultural expert here, as well as just an expert in understanding how her community has been portrayed in the news and media all along. So we welcome you both. And with that, I will turn it over to Dina. Thank you, everybody. We'll give a clap. I don't like these impersonal things.
Oh, okay, thank you, Ms. Shauna. Why pisnaxiel isquis DinaGiloWhitaker. I just greeted you in my my own tribal language, which is known as Insukchin. I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes from the Sinixt Band. I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Hashiman people in what is currently known as Orange County, San Clemente, near the traditional village site of Panhe. So, and then I'm also going to introduce you the way that if I was home in my home tribal community, I would introduce you this way by saying that I am the daughter of Rosemary Burnett, who is the daughter of Mabel Desatel, who is the daughter of Gilbert and Ida O'Brien Desatel. And so and I'm going to tell you why in a while, I'm going to tell you why that's relevant or significant. But this is how we establish our connection to communities as tribal and Native people. This is how we know who we are. This is how we are accountable to our communities. And this is becoming more and more important as time goes on, and is the case I'm going to continue to do. I don't normally introduce myself that way, because it loses, like, it doesn't have meaning for people not of that community. But more and more, I think that it's important that we do this as a regular practice, even outside of our own community contexts. So what I want to do is I'm going to go into my PowerPoint real quick and just introduce a little bit more about my work. And then I want to have a quick conversation with Desiree, and which will help kind of lay the foundation for why we're having this discussion. And then go back into my presentation to help to do some historical context, and also to do some best practices, and to give you some resources too. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And let me go do that. Okay, this PowerPoint will be made available. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but because there's so many good resources in it, will be made available for people. And here you'll see contact information for me and my website, and then hopefully you'll find the resources in here helpful. Okay, so as Mashana or Professor Goman said, I am a journalist myself. I'm really a freelance journalist. That's the bulk of my experience. I'm sort of like a Renaissance woman in a way. I do a lot of different things as an educator and as a writer. So I come to this work as a scholar in American Indian studies, and also who has become, a professor, lecturer in that topic at Cal State San Marcos, and I teach kind of a wide variety of topics that range from like I specialize in environmental issues. So I teach 2 courses on environmental issues. I teach a course on Native women's activism, a course on sports, American Indians in sports, and a course on American Indian philosophy, religion, and worldview. And so professionally, I'm a member of the Native American Journalists Association, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a while. I'm a member of the Society of Environmental Journalists. And I've won several journalism and writing awards for my journalistic work, as well as my book, this book here, the recent one that Professor Goman mentioned, As Long as Grass Grows, recently received an honorable mention from the Society of Environmental Journalists, which was nice. And my writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Times and High Country News, Indian Country Today, Times, Slate, Salon, Democracy Now!, a wide variety of online and print outlets. And yeah, and I was nominated for an award at the LA Press Club, which was nice. I didn't win anything, but it was nice to be nominated. So, so that gives you a little bit of background of the expertise or experience that I bring to this conversation. So, at this point, I would like, before I go into the rest of the presentation, I'd like to engage Desiree Martinez to kind of create the context for why we're having this workshop, this conversation, because it came as a result of a controversy around that happened with the Daily Bruin, and it ended, or it involved conflict with the local Tongva people, the community, and I want Desiree to give that, to recount that experience from her perspective. So Desiree, if you would mind taking a few minutes to give us the highlights of that from your perspective. You need to unmute yourself.
So thank you for inviting me to share the stage with you. And the issue that happened with the Daily Bruin, which is the student newspaper of UCLA, was that I was contacted by a staff writer in order to be asked questions about a lecture that I was giving online through the UCLA Fowler Museum regarding our work on Santa Catalina Island, and talking about how these crazy fanciful ideas of aliens and giants and midgets and all these kind of extraordinary pseudoscientific theories have been placed on Catalina and how it affects the Tongva community. And so I was interviewed and quotes were taken and I was able to review the quotes. But the article that actually came out really was shocking because although we were talking about human remains in our presentation, there was actually photos of human remains on the graphic that accompanied the article. And so usually for Native American communities and particularly for the Gabrielino Tongva community, seeing the ancestors in a public way that way, and even actually part of our cultural tradition is not to disturb the ancestors, and or if you're of childbearing age, not to be anywhere near the ancestors because it'll affect you spiritually and physically. We try to limit or request that the pictures of our ancestors not be shown. And so in this graphic, it was a map of Catalina Island, and there was a picture of a skull, and there was a picture of ancestral remains on display that was from a pot hunter who had a museum out on Santa Catalina Island. And although members of my community, when we give lectures about Catalina and we talk about the kind of destruction that has happened to our ancestors over the centuries, we do use pictures of ancestral remains, but we do it in a context of trying to teach everybody, again, the impacts to our community and how it affects us and how, you know, it should be changed today and why we want our ancestors back from museums. So when it's put into a context where the community is the one that decides that they want to show those pictures, then that's great. But when it's another entity that's using it, and in some instances, not even used in a way that helps the story along, which is to talk about and understand what my lecture was going to be about in terms of giants and aliens and things like that, then it kind of does a disservice and it hurts the community. And so as soon as I saw that article, I actually wrote an irate letter to the editor as well as the staff member who created the article and asked them to remove those images. And of course, there were some additional inaccuracies within the text that needed to be corrected as well. And this isn't the first time that it's happened, either whether I've been interviewed for an article or there's an article that's written by the Tongva about the Tongva community. And so it's really important. This is just the most current impetus for this. And it does take a little bit of education to understand some of the issues that surround writing about Indigenous communities. And there's no one shoe fits all because it really does depend on how the community and who you're talking to wants to be represented and talked about. But there are some general things to think about if you're a writer or even reviewing writing, to make sure that you're asking the questions: did the community approve of this? Are they being quoted correctly? Does this seem a little off?
Desiree, can you talk a little bit? There was another article that just came out yesterday about the Jan steps.
Yes.
Do you want to address that as well?
I think one of the big things with particularly doing articles within Native American communities is understanding the structure that the community is operating under. So within the Gabrielino and Tongva communities, there is the overarching people who are descended from the people who lived in the Los Angeles Basin and the 4 Southern Channel Islands. And those people are currently broken up in 6 different bands. And traditionally, for instance, the Gabrielino Tongva identified themselves based on the village that they were descended from. And so a lot of those bands, how they're grouped today, are also grouped like that. They're grouped by family. And so when you're doing an article and you're trying to talk about all of the people that identify themselves as a particular group of people, you're going to want to make sure that you want to represent the plethora of um, experiences and perspectives of those various groups. And so it becomes important to know the lay of the land, that if you're going to talk to one individual, then as a good journalist to present an unbiased view, then you should be talking and trying to get quotes or get perspectives from other individuals that are from, in this particular case, other bands, in order to really understand the situation. And that wasn't done in this last article.
Professor Goman, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just add, it's also good. We have amazing faculty on campus that can help with these things as well. And I will say that for at UCLA, we're actually very lucky to have faculty to get advice from, as well as the special advisor position. So there's a way to be preventative with mistakes. We have historians here who specialize in California Indian history. We have those who specialize in archaeology, such as Wendy Teeter, who've been working with the Gabrielino Tongva for years. And we have Shannon Speed, who's the director of the center that could answer that. So we have full staff and such on campus that can do that. Now, those of you from elsewhere may not have that staff, but I do think it's important to reach out to those on your campus that might have this expertise, your special advisors, if you have that role at various campuses, they can be helpful with that. So I think like part of doing journalism, right, is doing good investigative research. So it might take a little extra legwork, but I think when there's such a lack of knowledge in America about American Indians, that legwork should be undertaken, especially if you don't feel like you have a firm foot or hold on that.
That's a really good segue into the body of my presentation here. So let me go ahead and minimize that and switch the pages. Okay, so what I'd like to do is is give you some historical context about why we're having this conversation, why it's so important, and to give you some basic backgrounds, because the problem is that the vast majority of people have absolutely no education. There's nothing in their educations to give them any kind of context when they're writing about Native issues. And so I want to give you just that thumbnail sketch about how we talk about these things in American Indian and Native American and Alaska Native studies. So here in this first bullet point, I'm using these acronyms or these abbreviations. AI, NA, and AM is very commonly how we refer to these academic frameworks. So it's American Indian, Native American, and Alaska Native studies. So just keep that in mind. So the way that we teach about American Indian studies, the kind of methodological lens that we very widely use in our field is called settler colonialism. So we don't really fit in the context of what's often called post-colonial studies, because for indigenous people / American Indian and Alaska Natives in the US, colonialism, we say it's never ended. So there's no post-colonialism for us. We say that the system of settler colonialism, it eliminates Native populations in order to replace. So that we're looking at the broad sweep of American history of invasion, really, of European arrival to this continent beginning 500 years ago. And so in these 500 years of contact with outside foreign populations, it has completely changed our social realities here. And these invading populations, they come to set up their own societies on the indigenous, on the homelands of original nations, of indigenous nations, of native homes. And so, and when it does this, so they come not intending to leave, and it's the setting up of these societies on native homelands that results in these systems of, it's an ongoing system that perpetually works to eliminate native populations. And so it's a system of ongoing genocide. It's ongoing injustice, ongoing domination. And the way that you'll often see this written about in history texts, in journalism, in in media of all sorts, you'll see these words like the term plight. The plight of the Indian is a very common one. You'll hear of Native people having been their worlds being unfortunate, this unfortunate history that happened to them, or that they've been mistreated. And there's a whole host of other words that get used to describe these historical realities. But what these words do is they ultimately whitewash what Native people's experience in these 500 years of contact. And so it's really important to understand the weight and the power that words carry, words like these, the way that, the plight, it's as though it's nobody's fault, right? So American Indian history, the experience of genocide, of land theft, of injustice, of the most profound kind is minimized. And it's stripped of any kind of accountability to the populations who make these things happen. And I'll tell you that I'm not one to mince words about this. I just say it. I just say it as I see it. I call it as the way, from the perspective that we teach about this, and that we understand our own lived reality in this long 500-year history. Okay, so we say that settler colonialism solidified into this structure that keeps Native people having to fight. And what that means is that they are in a constant state of resistance to this impulse to eliminate our existence. And here the No Dakota Access Pipeline Standing Rock event that happened in 2016 is really the best and most recent example of that resistance, of Native people resisting this impulse of settler colonialism to dispossess, to disrupt Native communities. And this disruption happens in all kinds of ways. In the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline, that disruption represented a long trajectory of environmental disruption. So environmentally disrupting Native peoples from their homelands was part of the genocidal tactics that the settler population used and still continues to use. And so that's an illustration of how the structure continues to impose itself on Native people. So in this context from an American Indian studies, American Indian lived reality framework, we say that American Indians are not ethnic minorities. And this is really important language. I'm going to keep stressing that as I go along. This will be a re-emerging theme. This is a really important point to have that sink in from as a journalist or a writer or somebody who's trying to write about Native communities, is that we are not ethnic minorities, we are nations. And that nation to nation relationship or government to government relationship means that it's a political relationship to the state. And that's what sets us apart, even though we are minority communities and we are ethnic communities in that sense. Our political relationship to the state is what sets us apart. There is no other group of people in the US that has that political government to government relationship to the US state. And that relationship is based on this history, at least 400-year history of over 350 treaties that are still existent. There were actually over 800 treaties that were made over these several centuries, but not all of those treaties were actually ratified by the Senate. But over 350 of them were, and that means that those treaties are still in existence. They never expire. And it's those treaties that construct that political relationship to the state in much the same way that a treaty between the United States and France or England or Germany or any other country constructs that political relationship that inherently recognizes the sovereignty of those nations. These are extremely important points to understand. Okay, in California, California is a unique place in terms of the history of this relationship to the state, meaning the US nation state or the state of the United States. And it's in some ways it could be the most complicated place of a place where it's the relationships between tribal nations and the United States are the most complicated. It's certainly it's probably the most violent history, and it's certainly the most recent in terms of this violence that shapes this history. So in California, we talk about there being 3 periods of colonization. It begins with the Spanish, and then the Mexican and the American period. So Spanish colonization occurs through the missions, the building of the missions in partnership with Spanish military. So the missions, these 23, I guess it's 23 missions get built, under the watchful eye of the Spanish military. And these missions get built with, through the forced labor of indigenous populations of the California Indian population. And it leads to this dramatic population decline, in the early part of that relationship, in the late 1700s. And then, and it has to do with, disease, and it has to do with the conditions of forced labor or slavery. More and more, that history is being recognized as a system of enslavement. And I would recommend a book by the name of The Other Slavery, written by Andres Resendez. He's very clear on this history of enslavement, of the missions being a system of slavery. And there are other sources too, but this one connects California slavery to a much longer history of Indian enslavement on the continent. So that's just a side note for a resource. The Mexican period doesn't last very long. It's just a couple of decades, because then, Mexico fights this war with the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo happens in 1846, or is it maybe 1848? In the late 1840s, California becomes a state in 1850, and when that happens, we get an explicit statement of extermination as a policy of the state, and that happens in 1851 with the Governor Peter Burnett, who claims in his State of the State address, that it will be the state is, committed to fighting a war of extermination against the Native population. And so, and it happens very, very viciously. It happens over a period of decades, and Native people are targeted in these, in these unspeakably violent ways. And it happens well into the late 1800s. I mean, there are, bounties offered and paid. You could be a professional Indian killer. And, it happens in, as on the heels of the California gold rush. So, while we're narrating, and the way the history books have written it, it's this very highly romanticized, the gold rush, and, all the pioneers come to California seeking their fortune, but, they're not taught, elementary school children are not taught that this history is really about the violent dispossession of land, of Native peoples of their land, so that, invading populations can take it. Also, what happens during this period is there's, during the 1800s, there are treaties made. There's 18 treaties that are made with California nations. And those treaties get taken back to Washington, D.C., and none of them are ratified by the Senate. And so they're fraudulent. And yet the land gets taken anyway. And those treaties actually get locked up, they get locked away, and they don't even get found until something like the 1940s. And somebody who knows this history better than I do can feel free to jump in there. But it becomes the secret, and then it's later, they're later unearthed, and now we know about these treaties, but the land gets taken anyway. So basically this period of time, it becomes illegal to be an Indian. This is how Brendan Lindsay frames it in his book called Murder State in 2012, talking about California history in terms of genocide. And it's another thing to point out is that it's been very controversial for historians to frame California history in those terms, up until very recently. I mean, you could destroy your academic career by speaking of it in those terms, but there's finally kind of an opening now where it's more acceptable to be more honest about that. So because Native people, it's illegal to be Indian, you could be hunted and legally killed. Native people go into hiding because that's what you do to survive in your homelands when you are hunted for who you are. They go into hiding, meaning that they very commonly adopt different identities. So, especially if there's a Spanish surname, they'll say that they're Mexican. Or there's other ways of hiding your identity, but that was a very common technique to survive. And so all of this has had massive disruption to California Native life, and yet California has been written in these very romanticized frameworks around the gold rush and the missions, all this beautiful architecture, and we have a whole industry around the missions about telling these fanciful histories, and millions and millions of dollars have gone into building a tourist industry around these missions and at the expense of California Indian history. Okay, so on a broader scale, so how has the United States, worked around what are these policies that have animated the relationship between the United States and Indian nations? So it's varied over these centuries. It's gone from it started really with treaties, and we could trace the earliest treaties as far back as the agreements between the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people, who wanted the Pilgrims who wanted land made formal agreements for land cessions with the Wampanoags. And so, from then on, there are all these, hundreds of different documented events where Native people worked in these agreements for land cessions and for peace agreements between the populations. I show this photo here of the this is called a two-row wampum, a wampum belt. So the Iroquois Haudenosaunee people made these to commemorate these, as a cultural way of commemorating these treaties, these agreements, by showing the parallel path of the people that they were making agreements with. So these were agreements based on, fundamental, the agreement, integrity to uphold these agreements, and here you see a written treaty, the way the Europeans did it. So there's the different ways that these populations agreed to these new arrangements with each other in these very long relationships of diplomacy. So the treaties really form the foundation. Then as the populations of the invaders explode, you see more violence, more extermination as policy, the wiping out of Native peoples to get their land. Later on, you have, in the 1830s, we had this, sort of euphemism called removal, but that's really just code for expulsion, as in the language of Claudio Sant in his recent book called Unworthy Republic. He says that removal was just a kind of a whitewash way of saying expulsion. And then later, as Native populations become contained, then it becomes a policy of forced assimilations, and then you see the emergence of the boarding schools. In the late 1800s, the federal government figures that it's cheaper and ultimately a better, public relations way to stop killing Indians, but to take their children and put them in these boarding schools and take their culture away from in the civilizing process. So it's civilizing the savage Indian to raise them up to, the evolution in this hierarchy of human civilization. We're going to improve the lot of the Indians, and then later in the mid 20th century, it changes again to what we now know today as a policy of self-determination. So this is how, this spans is, again, this 400 to 500 years of contact. In the mid 20th century, the United States it comes to this it's very conservative era in the 1950s, 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s. It's very conservative. Conservative government decides that they need a final solution to their Indian problem, and they pass House Resolution 108, which is an act to terminate the existence of tribal nations. So this is another push toward assimilation, to absorb Native peoples into the larger body politic of the United States, and this would just literally end their existence as political beings and end that treaty relationship. And so this has long, harsh impact on Indian country. It impacts over 12,000 individual Indians. Over 100 tribes are terminated. They no longer have the treaty protected obligations of the federal government to them. They have their services ended. And it affects California tribes particularly harshly. There are over 40 or 46 tribal nations in California were terminated, kicked off their lands. And so if you think about it, that's almost half of the tribes that were terminated in that time period happened here in California. So more of this very harsh history. Some of those tribes were restored to federal recognition, but not all were. And just because they were restored, or had their political recognition restored, didn't mean that they had their land bases restored. A lot of examples of that. But that's something to keep in mind. In 1975, we have a new policy, as a result of massive activism of American Indian people and what's called the Red Power movement, the Red Power era, leads to this shift in policy that respects tribal, returns to a respect to tribal sovereignty and self-determination. We are still in that period now. So the legacy of this history is that some tribal nations have sovereignty and some don't. And that's where a lot of the confusion lies when people are trying to understand this history and when they're trying to write about them. So some of the master narratives, the first book that I wrote, All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, this is what this book was about. We wrote about how Americans understand Native peoples and the stereotypes and the master narratives that construct who Native people are in the dominant culture. And we wrote that most of what Americans know is based on very inaccurate information because you've never been taught it, or what you've been taught were basically lies. And so that leaves people with a cognitive dissonance of not knowing that things are really a certain way, that Native people really are still here. So some of those narratives, those master narratives, are that Native people no longer exist. There's a lot of people that still really think that they're, the Indians died off a long time ago and they're no longer here. Or if they are still here, they're no longer authentic Indians, they're not real Indians, for all kinds of reasons. Those reasons can range from not having enough so-called Indian blood. BQ stands for blood quantum. That's what we say about Indian blood, and that's the fractions of blood that define supposedly who Indian people are in an equation where blood equals culture or belonging to a community. So it's a myth. This is all a myth and basically a lie. Or the way they look, or the way they dress, or where they live. All these kinds of things, to kind of inform the way Americans think they know who Indians are or what an authentic Indian is. Some of the other popular narratives or myths is that Indians were doomed to disappear because they were backwards, they were uncivilized, they were savages. And so, this was brought to us by, Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny, is that romanticized framework of, the divine right of settler people to inherit native lands, because it was deemed by God to happen. And it's ultimately because Indians are inferior and savage. And so they don't deserve the land in the same ways that Europeans deserve the land. Other popular stereotypes are Indians are predisposed to alcoholism and other kinds of problems, socioeconomic and health problems. Indians don't pay taxes. Indians get free money from the federal government. I've heard that one many times in my life. We all get a check from the federal government. It's not true. Another really popular stereotype is something we hear around here a lot in California, that all Indians are rich from casinos. And that's, just one of the more recent lies and propaganda about Native people. Other kinds of narratives that we're hearing more about is this something that's called, we call the original sin narrative, and that's the original sin is that slavery is the original sin of the United States, and that's something that I think really needs debunking, because what that does is it completely erases. So we're talking about this process of erasure here, right? All of these myths, master narratives, these stereotypes effectively erase Native people from American history and from their own homelands. And this concept of the original sin, that the US's original sin was slavery, completely evades the fact that, before there was slavery, there was invasion, genocide, and land theft. And so this is something that really needs to be looked at critically, because slavery, or the transatlantic slave trade, really only can occur as a result of invasion, genocide, and land theft. So that's something that needs to be talked about more in these master narratives. And so all of this, is this systematic erasure. So I have these images here that Mishana had alluded to a little while ago about the something else. Like, this thing happened this week. During the CNN, posted this graphic showing, who voted, and they broke it down into race, like they usually do, these demographic kind of representations. And we see white people, Latino, Black, Asians represented, and then there's something else. Right? They don't really say who the something else category is, but Native people took it to mean that it was us that they were referring to. Maybe they were referring, certainly that would have included American Indians. That could have included other kinds of populations, but regardless of what they actually meant by that, this is a perfect example of how media systematically erases Native people, or subsumes them into some other category. And so, if you're seeing social media memes about this, this is where it comes from. It's like, here we go again. We're completely erased in these media demographic representations. And the LA Times, thankfully, picked up on that, and then wrote an article about the backlash that happened as a result. Okay, so now I'd like to get to kind of like this aspect of best practices, like how can media do better when writing about Native people. And there's a lot of different things that we could write about. This is really scratching the surface. These are things that I think are one of the most important places to start. And for me, it begins with understanding, like for writers or journalists to understand that Native people have a real reason to distrust media. And if that previous graphic about something else isn't proof enough, then I don't know what else to tell you. But that was, that happened just this week, right? So that wasn't like last year or 5 years ago. That was last week. No, this week. That was a few days ago. So Native people have a real reason to distrust the media because of these, horrible misrepresentations or zero representations at all. And it stems from these centuries of abuse of, this colonial relationship and being misunderstood and having lies be told about you century after century, and that the constant erasure. And so sometimes journalists will ask, or they'll be kind of taken aback that when you're trying to do a story about Native people and Native people will request to view your story before it goes to press, that's something that goes against most journalistic practice. But I will say that you should consider that there are really good reasons for Native people to ask you to do this. So, so I think that it's, as a rule of thumb, don't dismiss that, and find a way to get through that and to be respectful. This is a show of respect and trust building, because what what you need to do is build relationships with Native peoples, Native communities, to help build that trust. And that's what didn't happen this week with the Daily Bruin and 2 weeks ago. This is a breakdown in the building of relationship and community. So one way that you can do this to help build that trust in those relationships is to allow them to see what you're writing about them. You need to talk to Native people, and you need to talk to more than just one people. Don't think that you're going to make a phone call to verify something or to get a Native perspective, and when they don't call you back, don't say like you tried and it didn't happen, and so you're going to just write anyway, without really going the distance to make that happen. So you want to check several sources. Don't talk to just one person. You want to talk to as many people as you can about a particular story, and understand that not all Native people have the same views on something. And this is, under the category of not all Native people are a monolithic group. Like, there's great diversity among Native populations. As Desiree was saying earlier, the Tongva, there are 6 different bands of Tongva, and there's sometimes conflict between them. This is common in all Native communities. So don't expect that you're going to have a unified opinion one way or another. Be really careful about the language that you use when you're writing. Tribes versus nations is a good example. The concept of tribes is fraught historically, because tribes infers a sort of an inferior existence or relationship, Indian tribes, and we hear the term tribal and tribalism being used as a euphemism or a metaphor for some of the political battles that we're fighting now. And that, I find that really, really problematic and offensive. Like, for us as tribal nations, like, we don't have those nearly those kinds of battles. So to use that term tribalism to describe the petty political differences in the American political system is really misleading. It does a disservice to Native peoples. Better to use the term nations because of that political designation that we have as people with government to government relationships to the state. So better to use that term nation instead of tribes. But at the same time, it's difficult because the designation tribe is also a legal designation that the federal government does use that language. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's very complicated and fraught. So avoid the use of the term tribes when possible, unless you're unless you're writing about a very political, political or a name, like a legal name of a tribe. These terms that we use to describe ourselves, Native American, American Indian, Native, Indigenous, they don't all mean the same thing, especially the term Indigenous. There's Indigenous is sort of a popular term that gets used these days. Sometimes it's accurate and appropriate, and sometimes it's not, because there are Indigenous people that live in the United States right now that are Indigenous to someplace else that's not the United States. And yes, they're Indigenous people, but that doesn't make them American Indians or American Indian as a political designation, as people with that relationship to the state. So, double check on how you're using those kinds of terms. There's a difference between federally recognized and non-recognized tribes, as I was talking about before, about the 46 tribes in California that lost their federal recognition. They're still to this day, like the Tongva, none of the Tongva bands have federal recognition. And that's true of the Ahoshman people here in Orange County. It's true of dozens of tribal nations in the United States, but that doesn't mean they're not legitimate tribal nations or tribal communities. Something to keep in mind too is that you'll hear this term state recognized. Some will say that even if they're not federally recognized, they'll say they're state recognized, but there's actually no such thing as a category called state recognition. Not in California. In some states there are, but not in California. There is a list that the Native American Heritage Commission, this is a state organization. This is a good resource for you when you are working to try to verify the legitimacy of a tribal nation. If you're ever in that position where you need to do that, check with the Native American Heritage Commission, because they keep a list of tribes that they recognize as being legitimate tribal nations in the United States, organized that way. Another term that you should avoid is, or a framework of writing about Native people, avoid the arguments that refer to Indian blood, which is blood quantum, those fractions that imply, the authenticity of Native people. This is very problematic, and not all Native nations, have a blood quantum system that imparts citizenship in that nation. So it's very problematic. So I would avoid that. Now I'm going to get into talking about something that's a really important topic around ethnic fraud. And that's why some of the photographs that I'm showing here, there's too many to show, but I have 2 pages of them. Every one of the people in these photos are people that are known ethnic frauds in Indian country that have been called out. Most of us are probably familiar with Elizabeth Warren, with the way she has been called out for claiming Cherokee identity or Cherokee heritage. And it's well established by now that, she's not, and she's apologized, and she's had to eat a lot of crow for that. But she won't be doing that again. So Elizabeth Warren is not Cherokee. Here's another page of known ethnic frauds. This is really important because it's so pervasive in Indian country that these frauds are perpetuated. It happens so much more in Indian country with Native identities than it does in other ethnic communities. But when we hear, lately we've been hearing about the frauds of academics who have claimed, wrongly claimed a Latino identity, or, a Black identity, like that's happened several times. But notice how when that happens, it becomes a national story, right? But when it happens in Indian country on a daily basis, and yet it's not, none of those stories are national stories. So just understand that it's so common in Indian country that we need to be more critical about taking people for what they say that they're Native. Learn to be critical about those claims, and learn how to spot fakes. And there's ways to do that. And that gets back to when I introduced myself earlier. When I introduced myself in my cultural way by reciting my genealogy to you, that is a way that you can legitimize somebody's Native claims. This is a very common practice in most tribal cultures, that they will introduce themselves that way, but not always to outsiders or in mainstream situations. But there are things that you can do to learn to spot the frauds. I included Rachel Dolezal in this framework. Most of us know her fraudulent claims to Blackness, that they were fake, but before she claimed to be Black, she claimed to be Indian. And most people don't know that. She claimed that she grew up in a teepee and that her family was Blackfoot or something. So that was just part of her fraud. This one here, this just came out this week. This guy is a very well-known journalist, progressive journalist, Dar Jamal, his name is, and he announced that he's doing a book with this guy here named Stan Rushforth, who claims to be Cherokee in the Bay Area, and they're together writing a book on traditional ecological knowledge. It's a very serious topic. I take this personally as somebody who teaches traditional ecological knowledge. So here you have a non-native guy teaming up with a guy with false Cherokee claims, writing about traditional ecological knowledge. And they have a GoFundMe site where they're trying to raise $25,000, even though they have a book contract. The whole thing is insane, and highly, highly suspicious and fishy. But this guy has apologists for him in California, in Northern California. There are some people who accept his claims, but most do not. He says he's an emeritus tenured faculty, having taught Native literature for 28 years or something, and yet no one in Native academia knows who he is. So this is something we need to keep our eye on. There are so don't be afraid to probe a little deeper into people's claims of Native identity. You can verify through their tribal communities, and work, just work a little harder to substantiate those identity claims through community sources. The Cherokee Phoenix paper wrote an article claiming that there's over, just of Cherokee tribes alone, there are over 200 bogus Cherokee tribes. So this is the scale and scope of these kinds of frauds that are constantly ongoing. Also, the LA Times did a great job last summer when they exposed these Cherokee people, or non-Cherokees who claimed to be Cherokees, that got $300 million in contract funds. So they defrauded, they got these funds in fraudulent ways. So kudos to the LA Times for doing that. Some resources for you. The best resources for journalists would be the Native American Journalists Association. They have a great website. There's a ton of resources that will help you kind of sort through these very tricky issues. This is what their website looks like, and a list of, they've got a whole submenu of resources over here, and there's programs. You can get a style guide. Again, here are links to all of these things here for you. The Naja style guide is something that you can get that is insertable into the 2008 and 2009 AP style guide. So relative to writing about Native peoples. They also have this bingo game that you can just download this one, that helps you check yourself when you're writing a story. If you are writing a story that mentions any of these terms here, if you get a bingo, that means your story is perpetuating harmful stereotypes. So that's a nice little tool. There's a diversity guide, a diversity style guide that's online. There's a link there, but I post it for the reason of, don't just go to that style guide and think that you're being thorough, because it's very, very limited. It's very almost to the point of being harmful. Don't use that style guide. It's too limited. There's a book called The Elements of Indigenous Style by a guy named Younging. This is very specific to Canada. It's written by a Canadian. So there are things, and I think it's useful in some ways in the American context, but not all of it will be applicable in the American context. But I think it's a reasonable source for some things. Some other miscellaneous resources are this article written by our colleague Debbie Reese, who's very well known for her work on Indian children's literature, talking about, raising this question, are we people of color? And so she breaks that down, like, what does it mean to, are Native people actually people of color? And this really speaks to that notion about being ethnic minorities. So she breaks that down. And then the Native American Rights Fund is a major legal organization that is structured around American Indian law and rights. And this is a nice little brief FAQ, list of frequently asked questions. So so that's the end of my PowerPoint, and hopefully we should have, I wanted to save plenty of time for us to have a conversation, have question and answers, open to anything Desiree or Professor Goman might want to add to any of this. So why don't we open up the conversation?
Great. Well, we're going to respond a little bit first. I think Des and I did get a couple of really important questions in the Q&A that I wanted to start with. But first, I also wanted to just point out that journalism wasn't just watching an objective about colonialism, right? It was part in the process of the westward expansion in the United States and part in process of colonialism. It was a fundamental part of colonialism, particularly in the late 19th century, after many Western sides got printing presses and such. So I just want to make that history known of how the press has played into colonialism, particularly as it pertains to California in that colonization that comes later. The ways Native people were depicted, and here I recommend please to look at Deborah Miranda's book, Bad Indians, which is in the AISC library. And all of these books named in this presentation today will be in the American Indian Studies Center library. And Joy Holland is our librarian there. And if she doesn't have the book, I will make sure that the Special Advisor Funds provides those books. But that's just an important note that I want us to think, but also to think about how that wasn't just in the past, but colonialism still in journalism go hand in hand. And I'm thinking of this not just also in the way that we look at the way something else is not just like a mistake or a bystander mistake. What it does is it erases the fact that voter suppression really occurred in the Dakotas on Native communities. And voter suppression in Arizona, etc. Like some people had to travel 100 miles to go to voting polls. And so the force of colonialism and calling us something else has a material reality. So I was wondering, Dina or even Desiree, if you could speak to the material reality that has happened for the Tongva based on journalism that was part of colonialism rather than trying to undo colonialism and the structures of colonialism.
Good example of that. And it hasn't happened in a while, but if you go to do a Google search on Gabrielino Tongva, about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a kind of division within our community about what economic path we were to go to, whether that was to continue in looking at other economic development projects and or build a casino. And so, and this is actually a big kind of topic in Native American reporting. And so for the longest time, there was always this description of, and particularly in Los Angeles, and for people that are against gambling just in general, that there's the casino Indians or the casino Tongva, and then there's the non-casino Tongva. And the non-casino Tongva are more traditional, and the ones that want the casino are more progressive. And I actually there was a professor at a university whose name shall remain nameless, who wrote a book that included information about the Gabrielino Tongva. And when he was talking about the Gabrielino history, he put it in those terms, he put it that, you know, the traditional Indians don't want a casino, and then all the bad modern Indians are the casino people. And unfortunately, once something gets in print, both in the newspapers as well as in academia, people assume that they are the experts of this information and then go on and continue to use that. And so to understand a community in only one sense or one aspect of a perspective of how they think about themselves in relationship to the bigger selves is really causes a misunderstanding of what the community is actually standing for. And it's not just, you know, one topic that should, you know, be carried throughout the rest of their life. Of this group is always going to be known as the casino Indians because they're the ones that we're never going to get a casino, FYI, unless we get federal recognition, and even then, I doubt that'll ever happen. But you know, just seeing our community in that one aspect really does harm. So when we're trying to get something done, like for instance, one of the biggest things that I'm trying to do is get our ancestors back and reburied into the ground out of museums, and making sure that they're not disturbed in the first place. I've had some reporters, when we're talking about that topic, then bring in the whole casino. Well, if you had a casino, do you think that money would, like, I have nothing to do with the casino. That has nothing to do with what the most important thing and salient thing that I'm trying to tell you is that I want my ancestors back into the ground. So, you know, when you're using a one-trick pony or using a continual trope, and it is a trope because somebody is putting that, you know, goes and runs with it and then makes it so as if, you know, the community is horrible for thinking about trying to figure out how to take care of their people in whatever ways they know how. And it really does a disservice to then try to get our community to garner support for any types of projects that we want to be able to contemplate and complete.
Dina, did you have a question about how you've seen the material effects of journalism that has been more compatible with colonial journalism rather than moving towards decolonization or being used as an anti-colonial tool?
God, like there's so many examples. Like, where do you even start? I mean, I started as a journalist as a result of an experience that I had living. Like, I didn't set out to be a journalist. Like, that wasn't my dream job. That's not, you know, what I wanted to do. But it came as a result of my activism. And I was living in Northern California. This is probably 20 years ago now. I was living in Northern California in the Bay Area in Sonoma County. And one of those tribes that had been terminated in the 1950s, the Great and Rancheria, federated, today they're known as the Great Federated Indians of the Great and Rancheria, had vied to get their federal recognition restored. And so I was living in the community for many years, and I was part of that community and watched them go through the agonizing process. And it is agonizing. I mean, it is a horrendous, dehumanizing process that a tribe has to go through if they want to have their federal recognition restored. And it can cost millions of dollars. So I was there in the community, you know, watching all that happen, supporting the community to do that. And so that happened. Like, they succeeded. They got their federal recognition. They got it restored through an act of Congress. So, you know, our Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein wrote a bill that gave the federated figure, they're called figure, their federal recognition in 2000. So what happened with that federal recognition, though, was something that when they tried to pass that bill, the way that the senators wrote the bill was they said that we will give you federal recognition if you agree never to pursue a casino. That had never been done before, and it was a violation of federal Indian law. It was a violation of tribal sovereignty, and so that got scrubbed out of that bill. So the tribe was able to get their federal recognition without that clause in it. So the tribe has no land. They get their federal recognition, but they have no land, because just because you get your federal recognition doesn't mean you get land given back. And so they got their recognition, no land. And so now that they have recognition, they are subject to federal Indian law, and the kinds of economic development that that can provide. And so when you live in, when your home territory is, an urban area and you have no land, there are very few possibilities. And so they decided to pursue a casino. They had the backing of Las Vegas money, and they decided to pursue this. And they decided to do it. And when they did that, Sonoma County is one of those liberal places, the supposedly liberal communities, very predominantly white. And so when the tribe announced their plans to pursue a casino, Sonoma County had long been anti-casino. There are other tribes up there that tried to build a casino, and they were opposed so heavily by the community that they dropped those plans. So now figures trying to do this, and it just brought up all the anti-Indianism, all this racism in this white liberal community, and it was so ugly that and there was so much of the writing that was being done by the mainstream press perpetuated all the usual stereotypes. It put the tribe in such an ugly light. It drug up so much dirt. I was just so angry about it that there was nobody writing from a pro tribal perspective and putting all of it into historical context. And so I started doing that just because I was so mad. So it was like part of my activism to just try to get a Native perspective out there, even though it wasn't even my tribe. And so that's that. So I was a citizen journalist. That's how I started, as a citizen journalist. And it was a result of seeing, it got so ugly. There were death threats. There were all the usual horrible, and racist anti-Indian stuff that came out, and they tried to stop. The community tried hard to stop this casino from being built, from this tribe having any kind of economic development. And it involved everybody, even the most liberal of people, including the environmental movement. The environmental movement tried to use environmentalism to stop the tribe from building this development project. It lasted 10 years. This battle lasted 10 years. And the media had everything to do with it because it was not balanced. It was not historically contextualized. And the tribe was seen as an enemy to the community, even though it was their lands that got taken away. It was their history that was erased.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And just to note that right now, the Rancheria Groton, they have donated $15 million for Native Nations at UCLA, and the tribal, our lawyers at UCLA, to develop California Indian lawyers to continue to fight for those rights. So it all comes full circle in that way. And I just wanted to note that connection as well to UCLA. Also in the notes, I put Alexandra Harmon's book. If you want another example, she wrote a recent book called Rich Indians, where she examines the press. And Jessica Catalino, who's our very esteemed professor of anthropology at UCLA, who wrote a wonderful book on high stakes, called High Stakes, on the Seminole tribe, that is now the owner of Hard Rock Cafe. So there's a way that people think this is just about casino, that they don't take into account all the good that, in a way, that the money and the economic development has done for language revitalization, education, etc. So I think that's part of the unevenness we see by concentrating on casino Indians. So I just wanted to lay out the stakes for our students so they could see that there's really, it's not just about representation, because students sometimes are very into representation, and that's fine and that's important, or those equal representations, but we really need to lay out the stakes, as you both just did in the examples that you gave, the material stakes, the material lives that play for Native people. So I'm going to ask, I have one quick question that comes from people directly messaging me. Was it Naja or Narf that you recommended for the good source for journalism?
It was both.
It was both? Okay.
But especially nausea. Nausea is the, I mean, NARF is only peripherally, that's just the FAQs link that is useful, but nausea is really the go-to source.
Okay. So now the difficult question. This is the one of the question on authenticity. There were many comments in the chat area about authenticity. One of the questions pretty much was that Mati is supported by many of the Chumash bands. So how do you negotiate that? There was that particular question. There was a surprise that I didn't know that the Star Trek Voyager, thank you, Eric Green is here from UCLA Communications. It kind of disappoints me, was also a pretendian, and that's supposed to be important consultation that takes place.
Wow.
There was also a question, I think, by Ray Sato that was very important to ask. And I think it's important when we talk about cultural authenticity and ethnic fraud, that because so many of our family members, I have family members who are adopted out and came home, that how do you not discourage when you're talking about these authenticity issues with Native people? How do we deal with ethnic fraud, but deal with the recognition of communities, people doing the work, because Mati has done a lot of work. How do we deal with that, but also with that history of deep separation through child protective services? In South Dakota, there are several cases where as many Indian children you got, you'd be wealthier, which leads to horrible cases of neglect and abuse in social services. So, and your idea when you're advising on this, how do we account for both of those, the kind of messiness and nuances? And then the very basic question that come about with this authenticity is, how do you distinguish between, can you explain enrolled versus member versus clan versus band, etc.?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the easy part in the last, and those definitions are on my special advisor page in many ways. So if you go look at the special advisor page on tribes and how it operates, it's a deep history of colonialism and wanting to deny our sovereign politics. But
Yeah, well,
the other questions I think are important to get at.
it shows the like you said, the messiness of all of it, and that there are perhaps levels of contestation that are perhaps legitimate, like with Matiwaya. And I know that he is, that was a huge controversy around him. And I included him in there because it's local, right? Because that's a good local example of something that generated so much controversy. And I'm not saying
tribes themselves, I mean, as a scholar, like with Tomva politics, for instance, I try not to get myself involved with their business, right? Like in terms of policing Tomva communities, I really am very careful for the Tomva to do that for themselves. So how also addressing that element, like, becomes
and there's not really an easy answer to that, because I'm like that also. I try to be respectful, recognizing that it's not my community of heritage. And I think that it's important to, when you approach these things, to understand that it's very fraught, it's very complicated, that you don't set yourself up as an authority, like on whatever the story is. If you're looking at somebody that's problematic, look at it from several different angles. If you're trying to establish the authenticity of somebody, the legitimacy, dig deep to understand what the issues are about that person, and present all sides of the conflict or the situation. In the case of Matiwaya, he's done really good work, and that part of that is like, could be seen as ingratiating, right? Was he ingratiating himself to a community in order to legitimize who he was? Or do people do people have legitimate reasons to question his identity? So you don't have to take a stand on it one way or another, but expose all sides of a story, right? Without you can do that without taking
But I do
without
think that's where like a larger community discussions when we're looking at this, maybe we could switch focus to thinking about how when we're talking about issues of separation, child separation and adoption issues and those things. And we could switch to that because, I do think this is a Chumash issue in many ways. And that has been an internal discussion within those communities. So, just thinking about a wider issue, particularly for the students here, because I think Indigenous identities can be really complex in that
yeah,
way. So,
yeah, and that's the point. And the LA Times, took it upon themselves to make it a public issue, which is the only reason I brought it up, was because it did become, a local issue. But in terms of adoption, there's a long history, and I probably should have mentioned that in there, a long history of the US, in its policies of forced assimilation, of separating children from their families, through their boarding school policies, through systematic removal of Indian children from their homes,
unfortunately,
which
it's
led.
still true. That's, I mean, most of the children in Shannon Speed's work here is important to know that have been separated from their family at the border are Indigenous, right? So
Yeah.
this is still.
Yeah, and so that leads to incredibly complex problems around identity and finding, people being disconnected from their tribal communities, from their families, and then having to make their way back. It's incredibly difficult for them when they're trying to find their families and to be seen as legitimately Native people. Um, that's just one part of the way, American colonialism has muddied the waters for Native people. So, I mean, I don't know really what else to say about that, except that this, it's that history of colonialism that led to these conditions. And that's why it's important to understand the historical context when you are trying to establish whether someone's a fraud or not. You have to dig deeper and understand, educate yourself about the circumstances of people that make it complicated for them to either, prove their legitimacy as a Native person, or or conversely, use it as a way to cover up the fact that they're not legitimately Native.
Well, I would say in terms of this, for all the students out there thinking about who to interview and how to interview, one thing to understand is there's a difference between being an individual citizen or member or a community person than being a cultural authority also. For instance, Julia Bogany is the cultural advisor of the Gabrielino Tomba. She's somebody that can state she's in conversation with several people across several different expertise areas for the Tomba. So one thing to just note to the students is, again, it's that rich heterogeneity of tribal peoples, right? That one person can't speak for their entire nation. I would never, ever speak on part of Tonawanda Band of Seneca because I have not been given that authority. I can speak as a member, but I can't speak for a nation. So I think in some ways that's the nuances when we talk about journalism that we have to address. For instance, Desiree is noted to speak on behalf on the archaeology and on that deep, deep history that the Tomba have between land, etc. I don't know, Desiree, if you want to speak to this as well as a tribal member.
Well, just thinking about colonialism and the effects on the community, and thinking about community ties. I know a couple of times where reporters have stated that people who state that they're descended from Gabrielino Tonga people are delusional Mexicans, because they don't see us living a traditional, what they would consider a traditional Native American life. And, just as both of you were saying, that there is a deep history, particularly with all of the tribes along the coast, because of colonialism. We were stripped, a lot of our language and traditions and ways were stripped away from us. And within my own family, 13 members of my family went to Sherman Indian boarding school. And literally they had the culture beat out of them. So much that I had my grandmother's youngest brother moved to Oklahoma and changed his last name and refused to identify as being Indian. Of course, everybody knew he was Indian, and he ended up being Indian Joe in Oklahoma. But he didn't want to have anything to do with it, because basically he never said it, but it was the trauma of how he was treated when he was at Sherman and in boarding school. He didn't want to be Indian anymore because it would affected him physically, and obviously emotionally and spiritually as well. And so when you're somebody that doesn't understand that history, and you come to somebody who's a descendant and who may not look Native, so not even thinking about phenotype, but in terms of how they live. I remember growing up, and we went to the Southwest Museum, and we were learning about Mission Indians, and we're seeing these dioramas of half-naked people living in our traditional keys and fishing and stuff. My classmates didn't believe I was Gabrielino Tonga because I didn't live like the dioramas, or I ate McDonald's just like they did. I was exactly like them. And yes, Native people, part of what identifies us as Native people is language, cultural traditions, etc. But we're also part of a modern world, and our community and our culture changes, but our ties to the land, our ties to each other, our ties to the plants and the animals around us are still there. And we may, express it a little bit differently. But it's also one of those, so, as a journalist, you can't judge. It's not your place, because then we're within the same colonial organization that's out there. Even looking at one of the things that I fight against is the anthropological literature, where you have Alfred Kroeber, stating that Gabrielino Tonga were extinct in 1907 because he talked to the last one, and all of the other people who were Gabrielino Tonga, he didn't recognize them because they spoke Spanish and they wore Spanish and or Mexican-like clothes. And of course, we did that because of missionization. We were forced into missions, and we were forced to convert to a different religion and take on a language in order to survive. And so when you dismiss that history, that diaspora, some of us don't even live in California or on Tonga land anymore. My uncle moved to Oklahoma. I have family in Louisiana. When you see those markers, or you think what markers are for what makes a Native person, where you got those markers are wrong, because you've learned it from people that have looked at it in a colonial sense. And even identifying us as bands, clans, etc., that's all anthropological, and that's all used to dismiss us, to categorize us, put us in boxes, and get rid of the Indian because we were a problem. And what we really do need to focus on is making sure that the words that we put out there support Native communities, don't create hindrances. You always want to make sure that what you say is not going to affect that community in a negative way, because journalism and those stories have such outreach. I say the same thing about anthropological literature, and to the archaeological students that I talk to. You always have to make sure you're not doing damage to the community, and you have to think it through before you put it down in words what you want to say.
Which means understanding context. I mean, it always comes back to that. Something that was eye-opening to me. There was a study that came out about 5 years ago. It was a pretty exhaustive study, an educational study where they looked at the teaching standards of all 50 states. I mean, it was like expansive study. And they found that by and large, the way that they looked at the way Native Americans are represented in history books, in K through 12 history books. And they found that overwhelmingly the way Native peoples are represented are in a pre-1900 context. So Native people cannot be seen. So these are children, right? So children are taught that Native people really don't exist in the modern world. And so all of this is like, it shapes it shapes who you are and how you think of the world and how you think of the United States particularly. And even if you don't know that you think that, it's been sort of drilled into you that's the reality. And so that's the work of education. And so, it's all part of the, like, that's the colonial project that Michana is talking about. And that's why education is so important. But as journalists, if you're going to write about Native people and Native issues, like, it's incumbent upon you to educate yourself about, and be, self-conscious and aware about, what are the tropes and the stereotypes that you are in your mind, and maybe you don't even realize.
And some of those stereotypes, I'm sure everyone here could name. And I will just point you all to Native Twitter right now and look at the something else, which is making fun of those stereotypes over how real Native people are seen. They're either spiritual or I don't know, some of they're really, really funny. So that's the best way to kind of get to understand what the stereotypes are, the most current way I could say, or you can look at one of the style guides. But some of those words that Dina talked about, like plight, or talking about Tomva only as in a past. I just had this conversation as the LA Times wonderful map that they did of Tomva village sites, etc. They cut that story was beautiful, but they still talked about Native people from the past. And when we set up this workshop, I told students that it's not just the Daily Bruin that's been making, that there's people on CNN, there's people at the highest prestige of the New York Times, can be awful sometimes, that don't know how to think through that long trajectory of history, but also the present day communities that are thriving and living in Los Angeles, or still thinking of mostly, and here I want to ask you about urban journalism, if you see a difference between that reporting and that still thing that lingers, I think, in American minds about Indians live on geographically only on reservations. Like, how do you feel that impacts in some ways the journalism in Southern California? Or how you see the Tomva portrayed, for instance, Des, by the fact that, the urban was built on Tomva land, right? It's not like you relocated to the city. Right?
Well, and this is one of the reasons why we created Mapping Indigenous LA, right? People forget that, Tonga people are still here and it's still our land. And because people are so used to the stereotypes that Native people are living in rural areas and or they're on reservations, they forget that there are urban Indians. Of course, there are other Native people who were transplanted from reservations because of colonial practices in the 50s and 60s into Los Angeles and other urban areas across the landscape. But this is our territory. This is the land we need to take care of, and trying to dispel that we're no longer here. Just forgetting us altogether. We've been erased by buildings. And it's interesting that there are people who will fight for the protection of buildings and not fight for the protection of my ancestors from being dug up. And so trying to make sure that people understand, again, we're vibrant, we're here, and we care about our past, present, and future, particularly for our children, making sure there's something there for our children to be proud of and continue to have a connection with.
Dina, how do you see journalism fitting into Native futurities or Native futures?
Well, I think it has incredible power to narrate those futures, and that term that Professor Goldman is using, futurity, is something that we talk about a lot in Native studies, because we say that settler colonialism is based on the futures of settler people at the expense of Native people. And so if we're talking about decolonizing as a project as a project of resistance, it has to concern itself with the futurities of Native people, right? So that has to be the center of it. So Native people, we have to be able to imagine a future that centers Native existence. in the future. And so I think that journalism has a really powerful a role to play. I mean, that's why I became a journalist. That's why, you know, I took it upon myself to do it because I wanted to, you know, who else is going to do it? I mean, it's us that have to make that happen as Native people, because nobody's here to save us. Like, you know, I figured that out a long time ago. Nobody's going to save us. It's us that have to, unfortunately, do the work to educate everybody else. It's on us to do that. And journalism and media is, you know, is the way that we do it, you know, and scholarship too, working as educators, but making ourselves seen and visible in the American social landscape is how we do it. And I think that we've, you know, we're making ground. I mean, we're doing it. We're actually finally starting to be seen. Is it enough? It's not. It's never really enough for us. We're never really visible enough. And that comment about something else and CNN's massive mistake there is testament about what an uphill battle this is. And some of the major networks are guilty all the time. The New York Times is one that pisses me off all the time because of the way that they do it over and over again. The Washington Post does it all the time. The Atlantic does it all the time. I can't even get anything published in the Atlantic because they're so kind of averse to publishing Native perspectives. I know one or two people, Native people, who have been able to publish in the Atlantic, but and they actually published a letter to the editor that I wrote to them after the Nathan Phillips debacle last year, around the march and the thing that happened. I don't want to explain all of that, but you know, I was able to get a letter published there. But I mean, there are some places that you can't even get in. I mean, I've been able to write for the LA Times only because I had a friend that became an editor there a couple of years ago. And so I published a few pieces. I have not been able to get an op-ed published in the LA Times. God only knows why, even when they've published other, you know, mainstream articles, you know, or long articles that I've written, but I still can't get an op-ed published there about local land issues. So, you know, there's no, you know, tribal affairs desk at the LA Times. We have tribal affairs desk at, you know, High Country News. They're doing really good work. There are a handful of others. Tristan Autone, who's a very well-known Native journalist, got a job at some, oh, well, God, what was it? What place? Somewhere in Texas, I think, at a desk in Texas, in a mainstream newspaper. So, you know, there are inroads that we're making here and there, but, you know, in mainstream media, it's pathetic how much we are still overlooked. So that's my plug to any of you who are, you know, writers at the LA Times. You know, maybe you can, you know, take this conversation, think about it, and advocate, because we're still seen as statistically insignificant. That's the reason that CNN had that whole comment about something else, because they always say Native Americans are statistically insignificant to list as a distinct demographic.
Yeah.
When
well, we've worked a long ways to get over that. Now, I wanted to end with the important student question from the editor-in-chief of the Daily Bruin. And she's wondering, given the valid distrust between Indigenous communities and news media, there are times when the journalists reach out to Native communities, but they're not able to get back. And I know this to be true, but at the same time, I also know that sometimes I get asked by journalists to turn something around in 6 hours, and I just can't do it because I have meetings all day or whatever. And I know the Tomba, as a small community, are really overworked in so many ways, very overworked. in what they must do to maintain and put their ancestors first, whether that's getting to that or just, their youth programming first. Sometimes communities have their own things going on, but they want to know what they can do besides Google, which also leads to another question asked. Maura pointed out something very important. Maura Sullivan, who's Chumash, I'm gathering, pointed out a very important thing, that how is journalism in this new social media important, right? And I kind of want to put that in relation to what, beyond Googling, because there's some awful stuff on Google that's inaccurate, which also led to mapping Indigenous LA. And Des is shaking her head because we talk about this all the time. What are the journalists supposed to do to find the accurate information, right? The right information, because the information that's out there on Google can be really problematic, but yet the Tomvar are overworked. What are some advice for or recommendations for what to do when you have a story and you want to get it out there?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of said it early on when we first began, that there is a wealth of resources just on your campus alone, that you can, reference. Don't rush to publish a story just because, even if you don't have the enough background information or whatever it is that you're trying to convey. Don't publish something unless you've really thoroughly vetted it, and reached, legitimately reached out to the Native communities and gotten quotes, gotten perspectives. Don't you don't rely on, and I'm just repeating what you're saying now, but don't rely on Google for everything, but extend your reach in all these different ways. Learn what your resources are in Indian country in LA. And by the way, Indian country means everywhere there are Indian people. It doesn't mean just like a reservation. But amass your resources and call as many people as you need to call, and ask, just ask as many people as you can, but you are in a place of rich resources that you have access to.
So
And even if you're in further Southern California, Native professors can point you to another Native professor that can answer the question. There's certain questions I don't answer because my colleagues can answer them better. So, Desiree?
Yeah. No, so what I was going to say, I'll tell you what not to do, because it happened to me. Who the reporter shall remain nameless, but he was at the LA Times, and he pretty much stalked me. He called me multiple times. He sent a request via my personal email, via my work email, and then he showed up at my work and tried to barge his way into the building. And luckily, we have somebody at the entryway that just like, who are you? What do you want? You don't have an appointment, etc. And there are times when tribal communities just don't want to speak because a lot of that distrust, but it also was one of those things where I didn't want to talk to this person on the topic that he wanted me to talk about. And I think I actually sent an email like, please stop, contacting me. And he kept on doing it. And I actually had to write a letter to the editor of the newspaper saying, tell him to knock it off. Like, I've already, obviously, if I haven't responded to the 6 emails and the multiple phone calls, I don't want to talk to you. And I shouldn't have to answer the phone or answer an email to tell you I don't want to talk to you. You should kind of get the hint. So, there's one thing to be assertive to get a comment, but once you pass that line into aggressiveness and what I really felt was stalking, then you've crossed that line. So, I mean, it's important to get Native voices, making sure that I actually said earlier, making sure you're getting a comment from different community members because there's different perspectives, but, you have to deal with what you have presented to you, but you have to be upfront about, we attempted to do X, so this may be a story that only provides this one perspective from this one particular community member. You're just upfront about the lack of information that you have. But it's also like, I tell this to government officials when they try to consult with Native people, is like, sometimes they have day jobs. Sometimes, you're the stack of 100 letters, you're at the bottom of a stack of 100 letters, and tribal communities work slow. They're going to get to you when they get to you. It's not on your deadline, right? So with that comment, an emergency on your part, does it make it an emergency on my part?
Yeah.
It's the same thing with trying to get some type of comment from Native community members.
Yeah, I think that's important, and to do your homework ahead of time, right? Like there's a particular way I think sometimes we jump into the question. I find that when I'm getting asked questions as the Native expert or whatever, that people haven't done just the basic work to understand the history of the place they're in. So learning about place-based practices should be part of a technique of journalism. If you're located in Los Angeles, learn that history of Los Angeles, so when that comes up, you already know those answers. And I think that's responsibility, regardless of being a journalist. I think it's a responsibility of each of us who are guests on Tavanga to learn that history, of what happened here. Because if that had been done, for instance, in the article yesterday, then you'd realize that there was no reservation set aside. So you would have been able to fact check that particular comment in the article, and you would know that UCLA was not on a village site. We very, very, very much made sure that we were getting the place right in our acknowledgement and the lineage of the people and what they preferred to be called when we put together the acknowledgement. So I think these are just basic fact checking that could be staff, maybe the Daily Bruin, or those of you at other community college newspapers, or even if you're in upper state New York. I know some of my mentoring circle at University of Buffalo might be here now, but even if you're in those particular places, know the history of the land that you're on and learn those place-based techniques. I'm not a journalist, but I'm a person that highly believes if you want to develop better relationships, which is one of the questions, and I'm going to ask both Dina and Desiree to end with this. My suggestion, if you want to develop better relationships with tribal communities, you start by doing that work on your own and learning that history before you go to the people whose land you're a guest on. And so that's how, I think that's like a step number one. And you'll find that your journalism will get easier and better if you understand that specific place-based history. I've learned so much from Desiree, and I'm appreciative of that. I've learned so much by Julia Bogany, by Cindy Alvitre, and just so many people. I learned, but it's taken me years to learn those histories too. And I still don't get it right sometimes. Desiree is always correcting me. So on that note, what would you guys suggest for getting to know Native people better in order to report or do better reporting or to build those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have really much to add to that, but to say that, it's taken me a long time as well, and it hasn't always been smooth. I've had rough relationships with people from time to time, and I'm where I'm at now. In my position at San Marcos, I'm working with students from that area. So now I have to learn, in San Diego, the histories and the relationships of Kumeyaay and Luiseño people. So it's always a learning experience for me. And so there's a certain humbleness that you also need to bring with you, and understand that you will get stuff wrong, and be willing to be okay with that, to understand that that somebody's gonna call you out on something, maybe fairly, maybe not fairly, but that it could get dicey for you, and that you just don't you hear this a lot in sort of the social justice work around black around the Black Lives Matter movement, and other social justice work, that don't this idea of cultural taxation, like don't expect people to educate, don't expect them to do some of the education you could be doing for yourself. Like, go do that background work, do as much as you can, and maybe formulate questions maybe you weren't able to find out the answers when you did the research, and let people know that you really did work to find out the answer of whatever question that you're trying to address. But don't approach them as though they owe you something, because nobody owes you anything.
And Desiree, I'd like to give you the last word this evening.
Yeah, I mean, totally. Like I've gotten so many emails from students and just random public, like, teach me. I want to know. Or, I read the Tongva or Cannibals or something. Please tell me what you think. And, I'm all for education, and that's been my whole life in so many different ways. And it is very hard for our community members to continue to do that, because sometimes when you do have to do that teaching, not only is it spiritually, emotionally exhausting, but if it happens to be a topic that hurts, like me talking about our ancestors in museums,
Yeah.
it takes a lot out of you. The kind of first step is to actually go to public events put on by community. So there is, for instance, unfortunately, COVID has canceled a lot of those things that would have happened this year. But for instance, Cal State Long Beach, we are the host community for the powwow that is there, and a lot of times we'll have a table there that talk about our maritime traditions. At Curravona Springs, they have an event that celebrates the life of our ancestors before colonization. And we have dancers and singing, and we have an MC who gives little nuggets of information about Tongva history. So those type of events that are put on by the community, which we know is also not only for the edification of our community and celebration of our culture, but also to share our history and to share our culture. That's an easy way to learn. And you're hearing it from, like my grandma said, the horse's mouth, right? You're hearing it straight from the community, and hopefully the words that you hear are going to go from them to your heart. And when you start to listen to those songs and listen in those dances, in some instances we ask them, the audience, to participate in those dances with us, because you know not only are we caretakers because this is our traditional land, but you're caretakers of the land as well, and we look to you, the general public and people that are outside our community, to help us continue to caretake that community, particularly since we're in an urban environment and things like that. So that's kind of like the first step. And it's also, showing that you have a good heart. I talk about this all the time, is you come with a good heart. That means you're humble, that you're there to listen, and that you're not going to sit there and judge the community member and think you know better. I've had that happen to me, where somebody asked me a question like, well, I read blah, 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 this and that, and start to have a conversation with me, when in fact it's mansplaining or womansplaining, or somebody who thinks they know, or native splaining. We should come up with a word, right? Thinking that they know more about the Tongva than I do, because they've read all of the ethnographic notes a white man took um, in the early 1900s. Like, I've read those too, but that doesn't mean that it's all truth.
Well, thank you all. I hope there was some vital elements to tonight's talk that you can walk away with. And I hope that this starts to improve. And if we would like to have another session, you can just let me know, and we can maybe go even more in depth. I mean, these workshops would have been easier in person, but I thank you all for being here virtually. And I do want you to know that, again, American Indian Studies Center has numerous events planned. And next year, when we can have people on campus again, we do have plans from the special advisor position of doing gatherings and doing that land caretaking that Desiree is talking about. And that will be occurring as soon as we can all get together and come with a good mind again, and hopefully some good food as well. So I thank you all for being here.